So just a couple of techniques here, and then we'll close with making this more real, as I've discussed too. So one of the items that we spend a lot of time on, I have spent a lot of time as a Scrum Master working with my product owner and with the development team feedback, is to get very, very clear definitions of done. This really sets the expectation. This really sets the expectation for how what we are going to deliver. What does done look like? What is successful? And it is in definition of done. Definition of done can be simple, or it can be actual full acceptance criteria. Okay, so somebody had asked about that. That comes into play where you're starting to do some test-driven development, perhaps, or leveraging some of their agile techniques in here. The idea is that we need to know what done looks like so that we can commit to delivering within this the sprint backlog, the items that are within this iteration. Okay. As you become more mature, you get more stringent criteria, and definitely this is a real case of getting feedback in your retrospectives. The development team will tell the product manager that their definition of done really needs to get tightened up next time. Okay. And very different levels there. There's a lot of good detail underneath all of this, obviously, and I wanted to, in the short time we have together, at least give some ideas of how this works. So along the techniques as well, we talk very simply from this sprint level and the daily, so your sprint planning and your daily planning, or your daily stand-up. But when you look at a fuller picture, you're also going to be doing work before going into your sprints from a release planning perspective. So trying to figure out logistically how many sprints you're going to need to package into a release to actually go live. This is work done between the Scrum Master and the product owner. Obviously, releases can link into products, and then you get up higher in the onion, you get at a portfolio planning, and then overall strategic planning. So the sprint doesn't exist just on its own. It is definitely within the context, at least, of a release. Okay, so that's important to understand there as well. Then we call that the planning onion. Here's an example of a release defined at many different levels, at a system or a program level. Here you can see that one release, here's release 5, is actually going to be broken down into 4 sprints. That was the decision by this team. There's a rule of thumb, kind of average, you want a release every 3 months. But again, this is not carved in stone. This is all up to the organization as to what makes most demand of the business, etc. And especially if you're practicing DevOps, like you could set the iteration and you could have a week iteration of a sprint. You could, if that was your intent. Okay. Just a little bit more on stories. So wanted to share that everything in our product backlog and sprint backlog, what we work on, even stuck as index cards up on a visual Kanban board in the Scrum room, is the user story. So, and it's always in the same structure. As a user type, I want to do some action so that I achieve a desired response. Really, really practical to be able to continue to deliver that value and keep it customer focused. And you see each user story then can be broken down by the tasks to deliver that story. This is the work of the development team. And this, they've just kind of recorded the team hours that they're going to spend on each of these tasks. And this just continues throughout the sprint. And it all hangs together. So you see here a major release can be made up of 4 sprints. This one sprint is made up of 5 user stories. That's what was pulled into the sprint backlog. And each story then can be broken into tasks. So that's how you practically start working it down. It's actually very intuitive for the development team as they go into this. Very intuitive. And another technique we used here is velocity. So if we have historical data, if we assign story points, we can then calculate team velocity. So we completed 136 story points in the past 12 sprints. Divide 136 by 12 and you've got 11. So we can deal with 11 story points. That is our current team velocity. So how the heck do we get story points? Well, you can do it through different estimating techniques. Blind estimation is where you're going in that new, you're decomposing stories, very, very complex, not highly recommended, but it is a technique. Affinity estimating, where you take 5 minutes, everybody has their user stories on sticky notes, and they just intuitively stick them into small, medium, large t-shirt kind of sizing. So it helps very quickly to estimate some different categories. And then from there, you can actually go into one of the most popular, which is called planning poker. So this is estimating relative to each other. So I'm going to say that this very simple task has 2 story points, and everybody agrees on that at the team. Then what's next is, okay, this one's a little bit more complex, so we're going to go with a 3 or a 5 or an 8. It's based on the Fibonacci sequence. If you add 3 plus 5, it equals 8. 5 plus 8 is 13, etc. And then you can get ones that are so big that people say, whoa, wait a minute, we've got to break that story back down into smaller. But it's always an approximation. There's no real science to it, but it is lessons learned over time. You get better and better able to produce those velocity numbers over time. You can't do that when you first start. You need time. And then you can report overall on the success. So the sprint success rates, defects, your burn down rates, velocity, your output, overall satisfaction, and usually very low team member turnover here. And the reason for that is people are satisfied. They're self-directed. Large complex projects, so a lot of complexity can be involved here. This is where you get more into safe, scaled enterprise, longer durations and lengths of sprints. You can have what's called Scrum of Scrum teams. So just recognize that this can be scaled. Okay. And just finally, to close, where would I start? We'll figure out what you're trying to achieve, what best practices you have in place, what you can leverage today, and what your desired outcomes are. Okay? There's a lot of different best practices out there. All are complementary, which is important to recognize. And you can also look at it from a life cycle approach. This is looking at from the develop, build, package, test stage, and production, the DevOps cycle. Here you've got your Scrum development linked in with continuous integration, continuous testing. You've got your continuous delivery and deployment. If that meets your needs, you can actually have Agile service management. Here's your ITIL flow, so managing the life cycle, and as always, continual service improvement and lean, and everything we do based on collaboration, and can also work within the framework. It all starts to come together.